Savannah settles into the night like a city that knows how to keep its secrets. The squares dim, the brick holds the last of the day's warmth, and the streets around Perry and Montgomery fall into the familiar hush where footsteps carry a little too far. On one winter morning in 1909, a modest house on West Perry stepped out of ordinary time. Inside were three women, whose routines looked like anyone else's in this town. By sundown, the front page had their names, a crowd had its own version of events, and the city had a story it would tell for generations. What began in daylight spread to the jail yard, the courthouse, and later to a warehouse that still draws people after dark, with talk of a woman in white and a shadow that runs. We are walking back through that door in the order the day unfolded. We will sit with the women before anything else, map the rooms the way they used them, and then follow the moment the house stops sounding like a house. We will hear what was said from a hospital bed, look at the quick work the city called an investigator, and follow the paper trail to a verdict, an unpulled rope, and a signature that changed the ending. We'll stand at the present-day site and listen to what people say they still hear there. To understand what Savannah read, saw, and heard that winter, and why the story still nags at the corners of the hostess city, we have to go behind the headlines. The house sat at 401 West Perry Street, inside Savannah's downtown grid, where the blocks are tight and the sidewalks carry most of the traffic. It was a modest, some would say dilapidated, brick box close to the street, the kind of place where a knock on the front door could be heard from anywhere inside. The floor plan was simple, as most homes tended to be in the earliest turn of the 20th century. A small front room that doubled as a parlor and sleeping space, a straight hall that ran toward the back, a rear bedroom with a window that let in light only tainted by the Spanish moss dangling from the large oaks, a kitchen tucked to one side with space for a stove, a short table and a few shelves of crockery. Out back, a shed stood where tools were kept, and a little yard where laundry could be aired. Gaslight and daylight did most of the work inside. The city around it was busy from morning to early evening, and then settled into routines. The nearby Albert Square, which has now been reduced to a small patch of grass adjacent to the Savannah Civic Center, spilled chatter. The house was led by 70-year-old Eliza Gribble. She was English-born and a longtime Savannian. Being a widower had made her a manager as much as a mother. She kept the accounts for rent and groceries, decided when to bring in a boarder, and looked after the small details that many often forgot that kept a house like this going. Her habits were consistent, routine. A chair was pulled near the back bedroom window at mid-morning for reading. A newspaper was folded and refolded throughout the day. Her spectacles were kept within easy reach. She kept the pantry practical: flour, lard, dried beans, a jar of coffee, and a few spices. On fruitful, busy weeks, there was meat from the butcher, cut thin to stretch across days. She had lived long enough in Savannah to make the city's cicada hum her own and to accept a quieter pace at home. Eliza's daughter, 36-year-old Carrie Olander, shared the home with her mother while carrying her own routines. Carrie was partially deaf, so the world reached her a little differently, and she organized her mornings with that fact in mind. She watched people's mouths when they spoke. She kept to routines she could follow by sight and touch more than sound. After separating from her husband, she had returned to her mother's care and to the steadiness of a home that would accommodate her best. She handled errands that did not require long conversations. She kept the floors clean and the bedding washed. She prepared simple meals to feed herself and her mother, and whoever might be staying in the spare room for a night. Carrie's situation was common enough in the city for neighbors to accept it without comment. A grown daughter returning to a mother's household was as much of a survival plan as a domestic choice. A third woman had recently joined the mother-daughter duo. Maggie Hunter was in her early 30s and a seamstress by trade. She had arrived as a boarder with a clear intention of supporting herself. Her work was practical, and the hostess city always had customers for practical work: hemming men's trousers, mending cuffs, letting out a skirt after a season of wear, sewing shirtwaists for clerks and housemaids. She brought with her a sewing machine that sat squarely on its small table and turned hard work into pay. Spools of thread, needles in a strawberry pincushion, tape for taking measurements, a tin with extra buttons, and folded fabric links made up most of her tools. The front room offered daylight for fine stitching, and the table could be pulled closer to the window when needed. Maggie's move into the house was a straightforward arrangement. Room money in exchange for a steady boarder. If you map those details, a clear picture of life in the home emerges. A mother in a rear room organized around reading and order. A daughter who moved carefully and kept the center tidy. A boarder who turned skill into rent and aimed to build a small list of regulars. A house that allowed for all of that without wasted space, and a neighborhood that made it possible. Nothing about the arrangement was unusual for Savannah at that time. The address, the rooms, the furniture, and the habits fit together to support 3 women who needed a place to live and a way to keep steady. Friday, December 10th, 1909, brought the kind of winter brightness that is strong but not warm. The front door was not locked against daytime traffic. The table by the window in the front room still held work. The small square sewing machine, thread spools, a tomato pincushion, a length of tape for measurements, and a folded underskirt set aside. The hallway floorboards were clean where morning sweeping had passed, with small grit pushed up along the baseboards. The kitchen stove had burned hot enough earlier to boil water, then died down. There was no sign of a meal being prepared. The house was still until a passerby heard an odd moaning sound emanating from the cracked open front door, and when the man tried to push into the house, something stopped the door from opening further. Maggie Hunter's body lay like a doorstop, keeping the passerby from venturing further into what would soon become a haunted house. She was on her side, angled across the threshold as if she had either fallen toward the street or been stopped at the frame. Her neck was opened by a single deep cut that had bled heavily, bright at first and then dark. The scalp wounds along the crown and temple of her head had crushed bone beneath the skin. Her hair and blood had matted together so completely that it was hard to separate one from the other. The blood nearest Maggie spread fast across the floorboards. When the stranger finally pushed in and reached her, she was breathing and trying to speak. Her lips moved, but her mouth filled with blood. She was still alive. The man called out for help, and given that West Perry was in the center of the historic district, and also that it was still daytime, about 3 p.m., people rushed to the scene to help. The man pushed further into the home. Halfway down the central hallway between the front room and the back bedroom lay the body of Carrie Olander. She was on her back at a slight angle to the wall, one arm under her and one across her middle. Her palm turned up and fingers curled. Her skirt was pushed and torn. The bodice had been pulled in a way that exposed skin, and there were clear signs of force that matched the conclusion later written in the physician's notes. The skull injuries were heavy and repeated, an axe the weapon of destruction. The cuts at her neck were long and deep. Blood painted the lower wall at hip height in a rough arc, a sign of swinging that connected more than once. Bits of hair clung to the wall. There were blood smears along the door frame at shoulder height, as if she had tried to pull herself upright or as if hands had pushed off the wood to change position. There were no clear footprints in the blood, so the hallway told the story of a fight that ended quickly, but Carrie did not go without objection. The straight run of the hall offered no place to hide and no room to circle. You could go forward or back. She unfortunately did not make it to either doorway. Not that that would have ensured her survival anyway, because the back bedroom was a crime scene itself. In the back bedroom, Eliza Gribble was still in her reading chair. It usually faced the window for ample light, but now it was skewed toward the door as if she had started to stand. Her crinkled newspaper was on the floor, pages folded once along the center crease, and then fallen open to show a column of local notices. Her glasses had fallen in front of the chair and lay at a slight tilt with a crimson smear on one lens. The blow of the axe that killed her was from behind, low enough on the back of the skull to leave hair parted to white bone, and then darkness beneath. One blow was all it was believed to take to end 70-year-old Eliza's life. If there were two, the second landed almost exactly as the first. The wound shape was broad and blunt along the edge, consistent with the back of an axe head. Blood had soaked into the fabric of the chair where her head rested after the strike. A line of it ran down the back rung and dripped to the floor. Eliza hadn't fought or struggled. Whether this was because she wasn't aware of what was happening in her home, or she was just the first to be attacked, or if she just accepted that it was her time, is still a mystery. Witness and investigator accounts from that day described an axe from the shed, a common household tool. Its weight and the way the wounds presented on the bodies fit that assessment. There was no need to imagine a concealed weapon brought in. A heavy axe will crush and split on contact with bone. It leaves an edge pattern that is neither a knife and not a club. Eliza's wound showed that pattern very clearly. Carrie's head injuries showed repeated contact with the same blunt edge of a heavy tool. Maggie's scalp wounds tracked along the same line. The cut across Maggie's neck was made with a blade that was sharp enough to open everything in one pass. It did not look like a sawing motion. It looked like a committed draw. It perhaps would have been more merciful to use a knife for such a wound, as to draw such a line with an axe would take precision and pressure, making it unimaginably miserable. Remember, Maggie had only moved into the Gribble house the day prior. Savannah did not give her the warmest of welcomes. The injuries described in clinical terms by the doctor who examined the bodies matched what the rooms showed. Eliza had a crushing blow to the back of the skull from a heavy blunt edge that ended life quickly. Carrie had multiple head blows and a deep cut on the neck. Her clothing was disordered and torn in a way that supported the conclusion of sexual assault. Maggie had a slashing cut across the throat and head wounds of the same blunt type. She was conscious enough to try to form words at the door, and then again in the room where she was taken. The effort of breathing through blood in the mouth and throat was obvious to anyone who leaned close. What the first people inside the house had to do was simple and terrible. They had to make space to carry the one living victim out, keep the others where they lay until a doctor could confirm death. Leave the hall as it was. Note the small objects that told the story of what the morning had been before it split. The newspaper, the glasses, the thread, the tape, the underskirt, a chair angled for reading, a daughter who favored the center of the house because she needed to see both ways, a seamstress who set up a table for light. The scene did not erase those routines. It showed where they were interrupted and how finally they ended. The first hour after the discovery did not look like a professional inquiry so much as a citywide alarm bell. News moved faster than the officers could even establish a perimeter around the house. Word reached the evening press before detectives finished their first walkthrough. The paper's street edition sent people surging toward West Perry Street and then outward in ripples across the grid. That same energy spilled into ad hoc search parties. Contemporary coverage captured the tenor, fences were knocked down, doors were forced open, and anything that might hide a fugitive was pulled apart. This was not a measured canvas. It was a public hunt that multiplied footprints and hands over anything the killer might have touched. People were outraged that such a heinous crime was committed in broad daylight, and they would stop at nothing to find the perpetrator. Only, it's 1909, so the public, specifically the white public, had a preconceived notion of who they believed the perpetrator to be. Officers threw a dragnet over Yamacraw, otherwise known as Frogtown, the predominantly black district west of the city's business core, and hauled men by the dozens to the station. Within hours, reports were already quoting a round figure: 150 black men under arrest to be examined. It was not the product of named witnesses or a traced weapon, but the force of a theory. An assault upon these 3 white women had to mean a black assailant, by the mindset of those powered in 1909. The Dawson News printed the number and the neighborhood, and variants of the same phrasing appeared in other regional columns. The arrests were simply a headline, not an individual or substantial lead. The station house felt the backlash. Crowds that had for hours been breaking and entering under color of a search reassembled at the jail, angry now that the men detained, imagined or otherwise, were behind brick and bars. National Pickup summarized what local officers saw up close. The mass made the prisoners, also known as innocent targeted black men. The rumor of a lynching atmosphere was in the air itself, even if no rope went up that night. For those inside the cells, the danger was not hypothetical. The central report: 150 are prisoners awaiting examination, circulated with warning attached. Inside the hospital, a very different stream of information shaped the case. The surviving woman, Maggie Hunter, was still alive through the night, but in a precarious state. When the Baptist minister John S. Wilder reached her, as it was likely she would not make it much longer, one of the statements recorded from her bedside cut sharply against the streets and law enforcement's theory. She recognized that a white man had struck the blows. That version, as written by the Athens Banner, sat beside another hospital room account attributed to a physician. The culprit was Maggie's husband, and in the moment of the attack, she was restrained by a black man. Savannah's mayor attempted to rein in the havoc. The Banner recorded that evening's extraordinary request from Mayor George W. Tideman: do not issue extra editions broadcasting the latest turns in the case. It was an admission that the investigation was losing the information war to crowds and headlines. When a mayor begs editors to hold the presses, it is a public safety order disguised as media management. In this instance, it acknowledged that rumors were acting as a co-investigator. Officers had already put J.C. Hunter, Maggie's estranged husband, under suspicion, now had a reason to investigate him further. Maggie's near-death confessional may be all that's needed to solve the case, but it's never that easy, is it? Reporting from the same Banner write-up describes a sequence that would become the spine of the state's case: clothing spattered and badly stained, described as Hunter's recovered after a search, and a walking cane found inside the Perry Street house that multiple witnesses said Hunter had been carrying earlier that day. Even without a working forensics lab to match blood types, the scenario, his things in the wrong rooms, a cane inside the house where his estranged wife had just moved into, gave the police what they needed to move him from a useful person of interest to the center of gravity. He denied all of it, but due to his cane being found and his clothing stained with blood, the evidence spoke for itself. While the JC lead firmed up, civilians kept chasing the theory of the crime. Men were paraded into custody and out again. The examination of entire black neighborhoods functioned as a show of force more than a legitimate investigation practice. Papers as far as California summarized the severity of the manhunt in a single volatile image: people breaking through barriers, battering doors, leveling any obstruction that might conceal the killer. This was not a sealed scene and labeled evidence in lenses and envelopes. It was a city acting out the investigation with its hands and boots. The mayor's office put up $1,000 for information that would lead not just to arrest but to conviction, an important distinction that encouraged witnesses to shape their memory toward a courtroom end. The number appeared in reprints under the line, "Savannah is exasperated," and sat alongside the grim summary of the crime. Rewards always create tips, they rarely create reliable ones. In this case, the money arrived in the climate already hot with accusation. At the hospital where Maggie lay, the narrative kept shifting. To officers and clergy, to reporters and doctors, Maggie spoke from a place of injury and fever. One recollection set the race of the attacker. Another set the identity. Still another qualified the scene with the detail that she had been held by a black man, while a second person did the killing. The fact that these statements were taken down by different listeners, each with their own assumptions about what had happened on Perry Street, became part of the problem. Which words were the product of clarity? Which were the product of pain? Which versions were rhetorical choices made by the men who wrote them down? The practical result was that the trail could bend in any direction a decision maker wanted to take it, which plagued the investigation. There weren't any forensics or recording devices to make sure people kept their word, and editorializing in the papers was actually the preferred methods of sharing events. People didn't want news, they wanted to be right, and they wanted entertainment. So journalists would do anything they could to satiate the hunger of onlookers and readers. However, all roads seemed to lead back to J.C. Hunter. Officers not only traced items to him, they physically retrieved a bloodied rag from his fireplace and reported a packet of stained clothing in his quarters. A walking cane became a narrative prop that the public could understand. It was easier to explain a cane in a room where it did not belong than to explain the strength and limits of bedside declarations. So it was not common knowledge at the time that Maggie had named her own husband as the Axeman. Dogs were brought into the scene, a period answer to the demand that something had to be done. Bloodhounds from a local farm were led to the site and given their chance. Urban scenting is rough even with modern handling. On downtown blocks worked by pedestrians all day, with thousands of fresh shoes and a riot of overlapping odors, the attempt was theater more than science. Accounts of the time say no useful trail resulted. The gesture, however, served the moment. It showed the city that officers had tried every tool available. The next set of names entered the file by proximity to Maggie and to the house, not by eyewitness identification. Willie Walls emerged because he had paid for Maggie's room in advance and tried to visit her the day of the killings. That made him an easy person to think twice about. He was questioned and held, then allowed his bond when the theory against him proved thin. Others came under suspicion as investigators turned over every log in the backyard. A yardman, Bingham Bryan, would be taken in weeks later under a robbery theory built around a trunk of supposed valuables in the house. The line of thought was simple. A man who knew the grounds may have known what was worth taking. Though morally wrong, that was not evidence. Even as all eyes bore down on J.C. Hunter, the dragnet logic kept pulling in black suspects when a new angle appeared. By late January, police had Bryan in the county jail and another man called John Cooper, or John Coker in later records, under arrest. The reason given was not a fingerprint or a hair. A constable said he had spoken with a man in the yard that morning, and that was enough to hold and question. That sequence is important. Officers used encounter stories, not physical evidence or witnesses, to generate arrests long after the initial panic subsided. And these guys arrested willy-nilly. Suspects Hunter and Walls were taken in. one at a time to where Maggie lay, now deceased, as she had succumbed to her wounds. Hunter simply asked coldly when she died. Walls took her hand and called her a good friend. Neither confessed. What remained was the horror of the crime itself and the knowledge that the investigation had been based almost purely on emotion, not evidence. When the grand jury finally acted in February 1910, it did so in a way that reflected the investigation's two tracks. J.C. Hunter, white and intimately linked to Maggie, was indicted. So were Willie Walls and John Coker, black men whose routes through the story relied on association rather than a witness placing a weapon in their hands. The bundle of indictments summarized what Savannah had done for 2 months: pursued the domestic suspect while preserving the possibility that the first-day dragnet had been right. That duality would persist into the courtroom phase and beyond. For a city that had spent the first day after discovering the murders battering fences and doors in search of a black assailant, the arrest and eventual conviction of a white husband did not satisfy Savannahans. That dissatisfaction hung over the later years of the case, where clemency and a pardon would complicate the final accounting. In an era before modern forensic work, the most tangible pieces the state carried forward were not layons or fibers, but simple artifacts placed in rooms. A cane said to be Hunter's in a house where it should not have been. Clothing said to be his, stained and hidden. A bloodied rag found in his fireplace. Those artifacts were narratively powerful because they survived the damage done by the city's curiosity. They were in effect the only class of evidence that the crowds could not trample into ambiguity. Whether they proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt was a problem for later. In the weeks after the killings, they were the spine of a prosecution that otherwise had to choose among 3 incompatible stories from Maggie's last hours. If the goal was to gather and preserve, law enforcement failed in predictable ways. If the goal was to make Savannah feel that its institutions were not powerless in the face of something appalling, then the performance was a success. But the work that a jury would later be asked to trust, the chain from a doorstep to a cane to a packet of clothes to a man, was built in the shadow of that performance. Everything else in the file, from numbers to names to supposed confessions that never materialized, was a reaction to a first day when the city itself became the lead detective and the main contaminant. The court moved faster than comfort. By late winter 1910, a Chatham County grand jury returned 3 indictments: J.C. Hunter, Willie Walls, and John Coker. The bill reflected 2 tracks the city had chased since December: a domestic suspect at the center, and 2 men adjacent to the house and the victim's life. All 3 denied knowledge or involvement. Prosecutors made it clear Hunter would be the focus when the case reached a jury. That summer brought the first decisive ruling. On August 17, 1910, Judge Walter G. Charlton denied Hunter's motion for a new trial, noting the conviction for the Gribble House killings rested on circumstantial proof and opposing the statutory penalty. Contemporary accounts say it plainly. New trial is denied. Hunter has been sentenced to hang. With that, the defense pivoted to appeals, and the calendar turned toward an execution date. The Georgia Supreme Court affirmed the judgment, which left only the executive branch between Hunter and the gallows. The date finally set was December 22, 1911. What happened next is documented in the governor's own proclamation and in city papers that reprinted it in full. First, Governor Joseph M. Brown had already granted a respite earlier in 1911 so that John Coker could be tried. The theory was simple and public. Coker's case might clarify Hunter's guilt or innocence. When a jury heard Coker that December, it acquitted him. In the record the governor reviewed, a witness in the Central of Georgia's treasurer's office had testified to seeing a black man in the Gribble yard delivering several blows to a woman, a figure the state's witnesses tied to Coker at Hunter's trial. With Coker cleared and with seasoned Chatham officers submitting sworn doubts about Hunter's guilt, the prison commission unanimously recommended mercy. On December 21, 1911, Governor John M. Slayton commuted Hunter's sentence from death to life imprisonment and published the reasons. A circumstantial case, a co-indictee's acquittal, and the usual weight of local peace officers' opinions. The commutation did not end the case's legal life. Hunter remained a lifer, but his attorneys and supporters worked the only lane left: clemency. The file acquired long-tail additions that Slayton's statement had already previewed, conflicting bedside words from the survivor, the cane and stained clothing that anchored the state's narrative, and the unresolved role of other suspects that never yielded a second conviction. Over time, the prisoner aged into a different routine. He was transferred to the Confederate soldiers' home in Atlanta as a trustee, a placement that made practical sense for a Civil War veteran in poor health and gave his counsel a fixed address for petitions. A full break arrived 12 years after the commutation. On October 27, 1923, Governor Clifford Walker signed a pardon that restored Hunter's civil rights. The Atlanta Tri-Weekly Journal carried the image and the caption, "A 79-year-old Confederate veteran receiving the order from the superintendent of the soldier's home, flanked by his attorneys." The paper emphasized the span of confinement and noted that Hunter had steadfastly denied the murders. It was a clean executive close that did not name a new killer or resolve the contradictions that had shadowed the record since 1909. It did say the case, as built and sustained, was not one the state wished to leave with a noose at the end. Here's what sits on the Old West Perry lot now and why people still go inside after dark. The original house was torn down in 1944. It wasn't for any particular reason other than that it was old, a murder scene, and falling apart. In its place went a 15,000 square foot warehouse at 234 Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, the address you'll see on tickets and brochures today. By day, the building reads as a trolley storage base. Old Town Trolley's materials and local listings pinned their operation to that exact address, which is why so many ghost hunters check in under green and orange signs before the lights go out. After hours, it is a different pitch. Tours hand you EMF meters, temperature guns, and a spirit box, then shut the big door and let the space breathe. The building has named hotspots. The most talked about, as the section guides call, the slave quarters, a nod to outbuildings that once stood on this ground. Visitors report disembodied voices, the tug of hair, a hand on the shoulder, and thin parallel scratches that show up in photos later. Those same witnesses, or rather victims of the unknown, mention the woman in a wedding white dress and a shadow man who sprints the lattice of aisles, vanishing when you point a light at him. The equipment is not just for show. One TripAdvisor review says, "We listened to the ghost box most of the night and got to talk to quite a few different spirits, which matches what guides encourage. A simple Q&A when the EMF spikes or the temperature drops. Television helped freeze the lore in place." Zach Bagans' Ghost Adventure filmed here for its Haunted Savannah episode, pairing the warehouse with the Sorrel Weed House and giving the Gribble site a national slot as a lockdown location. The building itself does half the work. It is cavernous with long sightlines and cold pockets that settle along the floor. Sounds travel strangely. You can hear a word and not place it. That is the moment when people start narrating what they feel. A pressure on the back, a whisper that arrives just once, a breath where there should be none. The operators lean into those reports by cycling gear, calling for knocks and lights, and logging anything that sounds like a direct answer. The list of evidence on booking pages keeps circling the same beats for a reason. Enough guests have left with that same story to keep the warehouse in the city's after-hours circuit. We've walked through a house that isn't there anymore, stood in a doorway where day turned, and listened to a city that tried to outrun its fear. Coming back to now, it is hard not to notice how familiar some of these feel. We still want quick answers. We still chase the version of events that settles our own nerves first. And when the record is messy, we still argue with the parts that do not line up. Savannah's grid fades in the rear view. The moss and brick give way to concrete and glass. And yet the questions don't stay behind. They ride with you. If you sit with the facts, if you end up right where Savannah did, a husband with stained clothes and a cane people swore they saw, a dying woman's words that did not match from listener to listener, a courthouse that delivered a verdict, and a governor who said the punishment did not fit the proof. That tension is the echo you hear long after the story ends. Do you think it was J.C. Hunter? Do you think the case against him was built from what could be shown or from what felt likely? Do you think the pardon was an act of mercy for a guilty man, or the only honest answer when certainty never arrived? The point of telling it this way was not to make you choose a suspect. It was to show you how a city chose and how the file kept arguing back. The women deserved that much. They deserved a reading that does not rush to the part that fits on a plaque. As you step out of this back to your own street and to your own evening, carry the harder question with you. What do we accept as true because it feels neat? And what are we willing to hold in that uncomfortable space where proof runs out? This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.